Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Rewind. This is a conversation about the film Down and Out in Beverly Hills with Rachel Shukert and Melissa Broder. On behalf of the Taube Center for Jewish Studies, I am Shana Hammerman, the Associate Director, and I welcome you. I'd like to introduce our awesome panel for the day. First, we have Melissa Broder. She's an author, a poet, and an essayist whose works include So Sad Today, a book of essays, and the 2020 book novel Milk-Fed, which you can see behind me next to the giant Lego. It actually gets red, but I tried to have it visible. And so welcome, Melissa. Thank you for being here. Rachel Shukert is a producer and a screenwriter whose work includes Glow, which I adored, and The Babysitters Club, which we were just talking about. And she's also an author with published works in her own right. We also, of course, have the Stanford's Reinhardt Family Curator of Hebraica and Judaica, Eitan Kensky, who this is his brainchild, and it's always a delight. And our undergraduate student series director, Paloma Eisenberg, who had a crew of students watching this film with her last night over dinner, who hopefully have some thoughts about this as well. She's a junior in theater and performance studies at Stanford. So welcome, everybody. The way it's going to go today is Rachel and Melissa are going to offer some thoughts about the film. And then we will turn on our screens to have a conversation with them. And at any point, please enter into the Q&A function your questions, and we will bring them up with our panelists. Thank you for being here. Melissa, take it away.
All right, thank you so much for having me. This is really fun. It's particularly fun because I do a little bit of screenwriting, but I literally never watch movies or TV. I think the internet has destroyed my attention span. And so it was like really nice to like be forced to like watch an entire movie. Like to me, that felt, I felt like an undertaking, and I felt really proud that I was able to get through I think 110 minutes of anything. And then, you know, enough to reflect on it. And so, yeah, because I think that the internet, I don't know, it's definitely become my, it's become my television, and it has become my cinema for sure. And there's something really nice about, like, I think deep concentration. I mean, I'm still a reader, like I'm still a really big reader, and I'm also still a really big audiobook listener. I started listening to audiobooks when I turned 40. I feel like that's like what happens. You like get into audiobooks and plants. I don't, where it happened to me. So watch out. But yeah, so I still have the attention span for that kind of immersion, but it was like so nice to actually immerse myself in this movie. And so just like thoughts about the film itself. So one thing that I was like, is this a Jewish movie, right? Like, is this a Jewish film? What makes a film a Jewish film? I also noticed that it was a play at first, which that was pretty cool. Like I saw that it had been adapted from a play, but what makes a movie a Jewish movie? And I would say, yes, it is definitely Jewy, in the vein of, you know, we've got a Jewish family. It's not explicit, but, you know, it was amazing how many Jewish tropes appeared to, or tropes that I think of as traditionally Jewish. I mean, we kick off, well, first of all, Bette Midler in anything. I mean, how can she be anything but? Also, we kick off with like indigestion. That, you know, to me, I'm like, okay, we've got a daughter with an eating disorder. We've got therapy. The dog needs a psychiatrist. We've got the mother who believes in her son, and sort of treats him a bit like a prince, but also can't actually see him. And talking about how, well, that's how Steven Spielberg got started. We've got one of my favorite scenes, Bette Midler nasally meditating. We've got her doing the Jap mom shopping. So, you know, it's like right off the bat, there's a lot of Jewish stereotypes. I personally didn't find anything I was not offended. I'm not easily offended though. So, and I think there's something to me that feels beloved about certain Jewish stereotypes. I can feel that way if I'm reading Philip Roth, like Portnoy's Complaint. That was a big inspiration for my book Milk Fed. But anytime it has to do with appetites, I can particularly, I don't know, I didn't find any like offense in the, it didn't bother me at all. I kind of loved it. The stereotypes. I will say, like, there were definitely some parts of the movie where I was like, ooh, like in terms of things aging, you know, we say now, well, that aged well, that didn't age well. And like, I feel like I'm always on sort of, as a writer, I'm always on hyper alert and like double checking myself, because like the terror of being canceled. I always want to at least know what I'm being canceled for. Like I had a dream recently where I was canceled, and the whole dream, it was sort of like Kafka's The Trial. I couldn't figure out the entire dream what I was being canceled for, but I had been canceled. And so so I sort of like to work like offensively, if that makes sense. It like, or maybe it's defensively in terms of the fear of cancellation. So I'm like always on the lookout for anything that like might get me canceled. And so I sort of, and I feel like that's also sometimes how I consume media now, not even necessarily out of a personal morality. I wish I could say it was out of, but my moral compass is very flimsy. I think my moral compass just dwells more in the realm of terror. You know, that's where it dwells. And so there were definitely moments like the portrayal of the unhoused. I was like, wow, that is I don't know. I think now they would have it seemed, you know, that it was written by an outsider voice. It was not written by a member of the unhoused community. And I feel like that is something that wouldn't be possible, or wouldn't. It would definitely, there would need to be other voices, I think, included. But and there were other moments too, but by and large, you know, on a personal level, as a Jew, and since this is a Jewish class, I took no personal offense to any of the stereotypes, and in fact quite relished in them. My father was a communist. When Richard Dreyfuss says my father was a communist, there was a lot there, right? It kept going. One other thing I'll say, just like in terms of talking a little bit about my experience as a Jewish writer, or a writer who happens to have been born Jewish and raised Jewish, is you know, something I explore a lot in my own work is the inseparability of the appetites. So I think that like a lot of times on a social level, there may be, you know, especially with the sort of self-care industrial complex, right? This idea that we can separate out like like that we can heal a part of ourselves, but not like the whole part, right? Or like that healing is something that can be purchased. I mean, we saw this a lot with Bette Midler, right? Like she has her different gurus, and she's trying to purchase all she really, you know, and of course the answer in the movie is she just needs to have sex, but which may be a little simplistic, but maybe not actually. But you know, I think that like in terms of the inseparability of the appetites, it was really interesting in the film to see, for example, daughter has eating disorder. Daughter healed of eating disorder when she falls in love or has sex, right? Or you know, Bette Midler, uptight, neurotic, healed by this sexual experience, right? It's like the sexual experience, but there were like these answers. But I did find it interesting that the appetites were not separated. Like they were actually the appetite for spirituality, as we see in Bette Midler's character, right? Like that spiritual yearning, sexual desire, the appetite for food, all of them were interconnected. And in my book Milk Fed, that was the gist. That was the gist of that. So it was really interesting to see that theme reflected in this movie, and that like know these things, like we're like all in like the totality of appetite, and how we can't like parse out different types of healing or different types of appetite from one another. So I think that's like my kickoff. I'll leave that there. That was sort of rambly, and I will turn it over to Rachel.
Hi. Well, first of all, it's so good to see you, Melissa. I haven't seen you for so long. I love this movie. I always have. I remember seeing it for the first time when I was a kid. I think my parents like rented it or something. It was definitely not in the theater. And I always loved it because I loved the specificity of the time and place. I love like that 80s Beverly Hills kind of universe. And Beverly Hills still really feels like that. Like I feel like all the lettering on signs, like at the bagel place and all those places is still that sort of like 80s, like neon with like a squiggle and like it's teal. And I love that about, about Beverly Hills. It has that sort of great like frozen and amber quality. Just off of what you were saying about the stereotypes of the movie or the sort of lack of stereotypes of the movie, Melissa, I think I also really feel like even though these characters are sort of very obviously Jewish in a certain way, they do not feel offensive or particularly stereotypical to me. And I think it's because Paul Mazursky makes them so deeply human. You know, like I feel like there's really this like theme of like guilt and luck that really weighs on Richard Dreyfuss's character, on Dave Whiteman, in this very real way that he really feels very lucky for what he has. And while he's sort of proud of himself, there's like this sort of discomfort around the entitlement that comes with it. And that even starts at the very beginning, you know, with Thanksgiving, and it's about Thanksgiving. And thematically, that's a really interesting place to start it, because so much of this movie is about being grateful for what you have and learning to be grateful for what you have and how it looks to other people. And I feel like the characters even are weirdly less materialistic than these characters are often sort of put forth, that they spent their lives in the pursuit of material wealth, you know. And he has that great line to the son about like, it's hangers that clothe you and hangers that feed you, which my friend Sasha loves to yell at me all the time. It's like a thing that we do because we both love this movie so much. But he also, there's a sort of sense that there's an emptiness about that. Like that Bette Midler also, her character, I think, as opposed to like the character she plays in Ruthless People, which is sort of like a similar kind of like princessy, like Beverly Hills kind of character whose husband is cheating on her, who's sort of like a shrew. She really has this incredibly articulate sense of her own emptiness, as you were saying, where she really like is able to say like, there's a void. I tried to fill it with shopping. I tried to fill it with everything. Like there's been something missing in my life. I go to all these gurus. I don't know how, like, it doesn't feel like the movie is laughing at her. It feels like the movie is kind of there with her, trying to find meaning with her. And it's kind of like that with all the characters. I feel like with Dave too, like there's something so endearing about his kind of yearning to get away from this like empire that he's built for himself and just go to the beach and hang out with like the bums there. And she's so mad, but then she's able to like articulate about why she was mad, because she was afraid. Like they're all really very articulate about themselves in a way that I think you rarely see with tropes and characters like this. Like there's a self-awareness that makes them feel very real. And I really love that about the movie. I also would like to point out that Nick Nolte's greatest roles are always when he is part of a Jewish woman's sexual awakening, as in Prince of Tides, perhaps his most indelible role, which of course came after this, but I'm sure this is why Barbra Streisand cast him, because it feels like a very analogous scene. I mean, they have that amazing scene where he's like fixing her aura, or Bette Midler, you know, the whole headache scene, and it sort of like turns into sex. And then there's that amazing montage where it's like everything in the neighborhood that explodes, like the fountain, and there's like the flock of birds that like wings into the sky. And then the Iranians next door with the guy who's like doing the call to prayer from the mosque, which is hilarious, although potentially offensive, but very, very funny. And then she has that amazing line, which is like, you found my G-spot, but this was a one-way trip to the moon. And then she sings to him. That scene is so amazing. That's just her like monologue about like sexual fulfillment. And it feels like it also has always felt like such a mature, sophisticated choice to me in this movie that they don't make her fall in love with him. It's just like the daughter does, but she doesn't. She's like, that is what it is. It's just what I needed. Now I'm done with you. Like it feels so sophisticated in a way that I think movies rarely are anymore about sexuality. You know, I feel like we've like the sort of sexual nature of movies have become very simplistic, and there's so many rules, and you get them from studios when you do things like, oh, we'll hate her if she cheats on her husband, or we'll hate him if, you know, like there's a real kind of almost European sort of level of like like savoir vivre about this movie. I think probably because it came from a French play, but I really love that about that, and it makes it feel very like human and real, and like the way that people actually live, as opposed to this sort of Hollywood version of a marriage and a Hollywood version of a bad marriage, along with the Hollywood version of a good marriage, which I really like. You know, I feel like it's definitely it's probably it's also like I feel like fairly ahead of its time in the way that it deals with the son and his sort of sexuality and how that alarms his parents, but they're like okay with it, you know, like that, like it's all sort of part of it. Like they're, you know, they're a little confused, but they're not sort of like hysterical about it. I mean, that also feels very like they really are genuinely kind of well-meaning good people, even when they do bad things, which I think feels, I guess, just very human. Like there's a real warmth to this movie, you know, even though it's satirical. And the character of Jerry too. I mean, I do feel like probably, you know, we've evolved in our thinking about the unhoused, but I feel like even just the way that he sort of opens the movie with those like shots and like extreme close-up of these people, and the way especially that Dave treats Jerry at first actually feels much more like sort of humanist than I think most people in LA would actually deal with somebody like that now. You know, I feel like I don't know if anyone has lived here, and you go on like next door and it's like people are just hysterical about the people that have like the tents, you know, on the curb strip, or like the story about I mean, that's such a preoccupation in Los Angeles. And I feel like Mazursky really does have this kind of light touch with it, where he allows all these people to feel really human, and you kind of get into them. And even though Jerry is lying about a lot of things about him, he knows to lie about them. Like he's a character, he's like a person, he can do a lot of things, he knows a lot of things, he's got something to offer the world. I love too how they make him sort of like not particularly grateful to the Whitemans in any way, you know, like he sort of is, but he's also sort of like, I don't really like this robe. Like, I don't really like, you know, like all of that is kind of great. Like when he wants all these really specific things from them, like a low-cal root beer, like we're like, oh yeah, no, of course we have that, which is just so funny to me that, and they're all sort of like desperate to please him because he is this sort of, you know, they're the rich ones, but he's this like charismatic, like athletic, like blonde, clearly not Jewish guy, which is very funny to me, like the way that they all sort of bend over backwards for Nick Nolte. And I also feel like I have a sort of personal connection to Nick Nolte and the kind of roles that Nick Nolte plays, because he grew up in Omaha where I grew up, and he has always and he like went to high school with like my grandmother's friend Judy. Like I've always felt like, and his accent and just like his bearing, he's like all of the guys that like I went to high school with, but grown up, that my mother like didn't want me to go out with, but like I did. Like there's like a really funny sort of like Midwestern guy quality to him, sort of like not thinking about things too hard and being sort of like a little tortured, but in this very sort of stoic way that I don't know, he's very appealing in this movie. And I think that the way that he kind of fixes all of them, including the dog, is very but he doesn't feel, and this is what I think is like really strong about the movie, is that he never feels like this sort of magical character with magic powers and this kind of magic wisdom who's sort of kinder and better than anybody else, you know, like he's also just like a guy. He's just a guy. He's kind of on the make. He knows a good thing when he sees it. He kind of knows what to say to them, but some of it's genuine, but some of it's not. Like everyone just feels really sort of deeply human in a very smart way. And in a way that I'm not sure they would get away with now. Where I feel like people like studios and audiences are sort of more trained to have these simpler kind of characters and are not really used to complexities in comedies like this anymore, you know. It's a really adult movie, and I've always really appreciated it that. So those are my initial thoughts.
That was really great. Thank you so much for those thoughts. You know, I had a feeling that we were asking the right people to come, but just hearing you both say how much you like this movie and how long you've liked this, you know, it's really a relief. Rachel, you touched on this briefly of how you first, you know, saw Down and Out in Beverly Hills, but I thought I'd also ask you both to say a little bit more about your experiences with this movie and with Mazursky in general. I too think of Down and Out in Beverly Hills as like a giant video store movie, that it was so popular in a way that now seems surprising, given the fact that it was an adult mid-budget studio comedy. You know, it was always on display at the video store, and I can just kind of see the VHS. It's really just ingrained, you know, in my mind. but despite the fact that I always saw it, it wasn't until I was older that I actually watched the movie after I'd become, a bit more familiar with Mazursky's whole career. So I'm curious when you first saw it. I mean, Rachel, we got a hint from you. But what that was like, and also if you have a broader relationship with Mazursky's films, he's kind of become a forgotten figure of New Hollywood, actually. But from the late 60s until the late 80s, his films really touched a cultural nerve. If you think about things like Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice and the cultural and sexual revolution, and also An Unmarried Woman and women's liberation, and independence, he really was trying to do a lot with kind of the dramedy, that dramedy, serious comedy line.
Yeah, well, those are incredible movies, and I mean, the thing about, I think I was telling you before, I remember seeing this as a kid, but my parents would rent it. And I think I also rented it because like I said, I was obsessed with movies about like Beverly Hills in the 80s as a child. So I rented this a lot. I rented Scenes from a Mall that Paul Mazursky also directed a lot. It's like one of the only movies that Woody Allen was in that he didn't direct, and he's not very good in it. And it's not a very good movie, but I would watch it over and over again. Troop Beverly Hills is my favorite movie that I watched. I think I've seen that movie at least 300 times. I've seen it so many times. There was something just about this specific period in time that appealed to me. So I think it must have been my parents that rented it first, and then I watched it. And then recently, or not that recently, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I saw it at the New Beverly Cinema here in LA, that little movie theater that Quentin Tarantino owns, and it's like sort of a revival house. And they did a Mazursky double feature that was this and Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, which is another great movie, which, is a little bit of its time, but still incredibly watchable and incredibly relevant, and has so much to say about marriage and about like the frustration of marriage and like getting older and feeling like the world has kind of passed you by, and like the vibe shift, as everybody talks about it on Twitter, which I know that nobody under 30 is even on, but like it's that sort of, I think Paul Mazursky's real, and Next Stop Greenwich Village is another great Mazursky movie that I've always loved. It's a little more forgotten. And Unmarried Woman obviously is incredibly influential, in terms of like women's lib and that sort of moving beyond the romantic heroine, or the only place a woman could be in a movie was really somebody's wife, because it's about sort of somebody unwifing themselves. And they're all very much of their time. And I feel like the reason that they can feel a little dated, I guess, is because Mazursky was really taking on like such incredible social issues of the time in this way that was very contemporary. And I actually think has aged pretty well. It's like you need a little context for it, but he makes the character so human. And he also, unlike a lot of filmmakers that take on these social issues, makes them so funny. Like Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice is such a funny movie. It's still genuinely hilarious. It will make you laugh out loud. This movie makes me laugh out loud. Like I was in that moment where like Bette Midler, like without skipping a beat, like goes from like having her whole monologue about like being like a volcano and how he's like unleashed all of her anxiety after they have sex, and then she just starts singing like, it's hilarious. I had to pause the movie this last time I was laughing so hard. It's so funny, and he really lets women be funny also, Mazursky does, which I think is sort of rare for men of his generation, although it's certainly not necessarily in his cohort. I used to always see him at the Grove with Mel Brooks when they had their little old man table when Paul Mazursky was still alive. And Mel Brooks is another incredibly feminist filmmaker, I think, which is a whole other panel. But yeah, I mean, he's very specific to his place of time. But I think if you feel like he's sort of a forgotten filmmaker, I think it's unjustified, because they're really good movies, and they really are for grown-ups,
So to piggyback off of that, so I first saw Down and Out in Beverly Hills, I think like maybe a couple years after it came out, and I was young, and I saw it at Emily Briskin's house, which is where you go to watch the movies that you're like not really supposed to be watching yet, because I was an older sister with a younger sister, but Emily was like the third or fourth of like 3 olders. So like, if you have the older siblings, you get to watch, like you're more advanced, right? And one thing, it was really cool actually, because to see like the portrayal of money in the 80s, and then to look at like contextually, like these are supposed to be some very rich people. But the portrayal of money now, it just like blows that away. Like I was like, oh, their house isn't even, I mean, yes, they have a big house in Beverly Hills. Yes. Are they driving Rolls Royce and a Mercedes? Like clearly these are like wealthy people, but it was like the notions of wealth in the 80s were like so much smaller of a scale than wealth is portrayed in 2022. And just even like the sizes of houses now, like everything, is a little bit more steroidal. So, so that was interesting. It was also really, I hadn't seen it since I was at Emily's, and it was interesting too to like, now as someone, because I grew up on the East Coast, and now as someone who lives in LA, it was really fun to sort of feel like I have like the inside tip. I didn't move to Los Angeles for anything like movie related. I moved because of my husband's like, he had like a health crisis, but like it is always really cool to be like, oh, that's sort of my street now. Like when Nick Nolte was like at the park in Beverly Hills, I was like, oh, I've run through that park, right? It's not my park. I don't own it. You get this feeling, there's like a feeling of camaraderie and shared. And it's weird because I couldn't have predicted when I watched it the first time that like Beverly Hills is such an iconic location, as like a young girl living in Philadelphia, that would become sort of something that I could feel was in part mine. Even though, as I said, I don't own the park. I also, one thing too, I will say, I couldn't remember when I was watching whether he's ever reunited with his old dog. And I was rooting for the reunion. And I was sad that didn't happen. I just wanted to like throw that in there, thinking about him at the park. Yeah. And in terms of Mazursky, he did the most recent movie, or the last time I watched a Paul Mazursky movie was I watched his version of Enemies: A Love Story, which is actually one of my favorite Isaac Bashevis Singer novels. It's incredible, and I thought he did a really good job. So if you like I.B. Singer, or you wanna do like a double, where you read the book and watch the film. But yeah, Scenes from a Mall is a classic. There's something really lovable about all of his movies. There's something really endearing.
Yeah.
Scenes from a Mall is definitely a movie that my parents took me to in the theater because they didn't have a babysitter and they wanted to go see that movie. I've also seen Troop Beverly Hills a million times because I have an older sister. And that was one of her favorite movies, and she was in charge of choosing, what VHS tapes got played most of the time. So very much relate to everything that's been said so far. So on that notion of, Los Angeles and what it means, that's definitely something I wanted to talk about. I think this movie gives you can kind of split its title, and you have like the down and out story, and you also have the Beverly Hills story. And obviously the two are connected. But there are weighty social issues that this movie does try and treat in like a real humanist way, as we've been saying. And it's also LA. It's also Beverly Hills. So neither of you are from Los Angeles, but it's a place that kind of drew you, and now you've gotten to know. So Melissa, you already spoke a little bit about this, about how you now are the owner of this park. So obviously Paul Mazursky's LA, was something that's very appealing and exciting. But I'm kind of curious how you feel this stacks up against other cinematic depictions of the city, and what Mazursky's LA offers, what Mazursky's Beverly Hills offers that others don't.
Well, it was interesting. So I lived in Venice when I first moved to Los Angeles 9 years ago. And like when in that moment where Nick Nolte was like, we're going to the beach, I've got some friends, I was like, oh, well, I know where they're going, and I've always felt, it's actually a line in my book, The Pisces too, which is set in Venice Beach. Like if you are unhoused in LA and you don't live in Venice, if you're unhoused period in America and you don't live in Venice, like you're doing something wrong. Like it's just like a great fucking place, in a lot of ways. And still symbolic, and still has that sort of, the value of freedom, you know? And but it's also interesting too, because in the movie, you know, it's in the 80s and they're like, oh, so it's basically like Richard Dreyfuss says, oh, so it's just the 60s here still. And that's sort of how I feel about maybe not contemporary Venice, because I do think like, you know, the influence of tech companies moving in like has definitely created some sort of vibe shift. But like the art of Venice, it's still the 60s, right? Like you walk on the boardwalk and there's like a Doors cover band. Everything is like a Jim Morrison memorial. I think Jim Morrison spent like 2 minutes in Venice. Like it was like him, the Doors were started there on the beach because like him and Ray Manzarek had like one conversation. They like met up there, you know? And like it's sort of the conversation that launched 1,000 Jim Morrison murals. So I thought I don't know, I liked his Venice. I thought his Venice was felt pretty real to me as someone who lived there for 4 years.
Yeah, I agree. I haven't spent that much time in Venice, but I have been there. It does feel like that. I feel like watching stuff from the 80s growing up, I really thought everyone that lives in LA was very rich because everything was always set in Beverly Hills, and you always had the sense the filmmakers were kind of making like, you know, depicting their own milieu. So like, it's like this, it's all those Mazursky movies, right? It's True Beverly Hills. There's also like Steve Martin, like LA Story. Like it's always this sort of Hollywood or Hollywood adjacent, like driving around, eating in fancy restaurants. It all feels very like Curb Your Enthusiasm. Like it's that LA, you know? And I feel like when you see LA now, people on film, there's a lot more depictions of sort of like the East Side, you know? And like, it's all like a little funkier and more kind of it's like the Brooklynization of LA. And I miss like the LA, like, like a full sort of like unapologetic. It's one of the great things about Clueless too, like the big house, the gardener out front, the Rolls Royce, the gazillion shopping bags. Like that was the LA that I always sort of fantasized about as a kid. And it's not necessarily the LA that I live in, but I do brush up against it now and then. But it's like it's a very specific thing, and it feels very different than New York, even though the people, I feel like they're always New York transplants, you know, it's always like someone gets excited that like, oh, you're from Brooklyn? Yeah, me too. I grew up there. Yeah. Like there's always that sort of thing. But the difference is I feel like in LA, you're sort of expected to have like set all of your like neurotic tendencies aside by the time you get here. Like there's always a sense of like, we made it and now it's the good life and it's sunny all the time and it's swimming pools and there's this incredible pressure for like enlightenment that you see in this sort of Bette Midler character that I think is still there. I mean, like the trappings of it have changed a little bit. It's a little bit less like pet psychiatrists and stuff, but people still do that, you know, like everyone's like obsessed with astrology and like wellness and all of that stuff. And like, that is so LA and it doesn't go away. And I feel like I'll go home now I'm home, like, and by home, I mean New York, where I lived forever. Because I feel like Omaha is sort of so far in the past. But and I'll talk about like, oh, well, when I had COVID, my manager called her acupuncturist, and then she gave me these herbs to take that like my assistant picked up in the parking lot of the Ralphs in Beverly Hills. And they all look at me like I'm like a character in this movie. You know, and I enjoy that. I like the feeling of it, and it is really real, you know. And I think that when you see that depicted in LA, like it's a little bit of an LA stereotype, but it's sort of a true one, you know, especially in this particular kind of demographic, I guess, for lack of a better word. But yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think if there's any like other great. I don't know. I also like the movies like this that are not, because so many LA movies are really about like fame, right? Or about Hollywood and like the dark side of fame, you know, like sort of Sunset Boulevard, like that kind of thing, or about like what happens with the business. And I like the LA that in movies that's sort of just like adjacent to the business, but not really about it. Like the people that kind of live in that shadow and like, yeah, your neighbor is Little Richard and he's not playing himself, but he kind of is, or like, but like, or like, you know, or like how in True Beverly Hills, like how like the one girl in the troupe is an actress on a TV show and like but like not everybody is, like that feels very LA to me too. Just this sort of normalization of Hollywood people while not necessarily having to be like a Hollywood story.
I think one of my favorite LA scenes in this movie is when he's driving over the highway and you can see the kind of the West Side office buildings, you know, in the background, and everything's covered in glass. And he's listening to the talk radio show and it's Bette Midler conveying her problems that she's having.
I'm gone,
in
I'm
this
26.
Yeah, and you see Dreyfuss looking around and realizing what is happening and how this is his story, and that feels very much both something really smart and clever that Mazursky's doing is reflecting on kind of the way media is shaping all of the conversations, and just having the son be obsessed with videos and having the son only being able to communicate with his parents by making his kind of very MTV inflected Betamax tapes, art movies. But also even just the way that the kind of musical cues in this movie function. It seems very smart and reflective on media and what media was doing within the household, in the 1980s. Obviously opening with Once in a Lifetime, which I'm pretty sure is the live version, but other cues such as California Girls, except it's the 80s cover. Randy Newman, which is a little on the nose, but he doesn't play the chorus, so you don't fully get that. And then, of course, there's the moment where the son comes down and says "Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind" as the security group is coming. So I'm wondering how you reacted to the media in this movie and like the way it was shaping, the house. Question for everyone, both.
I didn't think about it. You just made me think about it. I thought more, but I mean, it's definitely a movie that's extremely grounded in place, right? Even just like the technology, I mean, even like the phone, right? Like the car phone, and he has the accident while he's like, I need to know who to get mad at. Well, there's, whenever I watch movies from a pre-internet time, I'm always like, oh, how quaint. Like there's something so sweet, and I forget too that sort of the old narrative of media doom was, that TV was rotting the brains of children, right? And like that I Want My MTV was like a rebellion against that. And because now it just seems like that just all seems so very innocent. And the even down to the limited number of choices, right? Like the fact that Richard Dreyfuss is listening to the radio show, like the one of, I guess not that many, not like serious, not infinite choice that his wife happens to be calling into. There's a real sort of everything feels smaller. And maybe that's what I was sort of also reflecting on in terms of the portrayal of wealth, right? Like less infinite choice. And I think that the internet has really changed that. But the thing that I couldn't believe how many, I know dogs are not media, but I couldn't believe how many dog reactions. I mean, he really rocked a dog reaction. I mean, I would say there were like 20 dog reaction moments, right? Like he loved it's a movie, and I don't know. And to me, that feels very LA because I always say LA is a very lonely place, and that's why we all have our dogs. But
dog just died.
Oh no.
Oh no.
I know, just to make things take a tragic turn.
Oh no.
It's been like the worst month of my life.
Oh my God.
I know. It's so sad.
How did the dog stuff hit you? In the movie?
Well, Matisse, that dog really reminds me of my dog, Charlie, who, as much as we all adored him, was a very bad dog. Who was always really mean to everybody except for like one or two people. And I thought I actually cried in the scene with the dog psychiatrist. It really hit home. And just him losing Kerouac at the beginning, and I was like, oh, I forgot that this movie is a tragedy about dogs. It's all about
that was extremely painful and intense for me with Kerouac. I was waiting for Kerouac resolution.
Very sad. I know. And what the fuck is that woman doing just taking him home with her? She doesn't check, like she doesn't. I was so mad at that lady in the jogging shorts that like gives him like a bunch of like muffin or whatever she has in that bag, and then like just like takes him. How dare she?
I know. No, that was really upsetting.
Yeah. Yeah, but I also, it's exactly the kind of thing that happens in LA because everyone is such an insane dog person who thinks they're like rescuing a dog. But yeah, I don't know. But yeah, the it's very funny to me that the dog is named Matisse, because now I feel like I know many children named Matisse. My son has many peers named things like Matisse, which is funny to me that it's graduated from being a dog name to a human name.
I don't think it's hit humans here in this area. I haven't met any. I have a son who's 6 and a daughter who's 2.5, and we haven't met any Matisses.
Neither of them are named Matisse.
No. Maybe I'll have that to look forward to in the next couple of years.
The next time I see, I'll be like, oh, did you name it after the dog in Down and Out in Beverly Hills? Is that what your son is named after?
So maybe one way to keep this going is to think. There's a great line in the movie where he's explaining the dog food, and Nick Nolte's trying to analyze why the dog doesn't eat, and he's explaining like you have to mix up the textures, and he goes down, and he has this line of people treat dogs with more humanity, than other people, and I think that is one of the things that this movie is really trying to get across, and why its portrayal of the unhoused is kind of complicated, but it's coming from this ethical position of we're living in this place where people will treat their dogs with more humanity than they will other people.
Yeah.
And so I have to advocate for my own humanity. Like you mentioned the scene with the terry cloth robe, that also happens when he first comes out of the pool, and they give him a glass of liquor, and he kind of spits it out, and he says, "You got any Crevassier?" So it's a very good joke about class and money and who has them, but also about how we value and kind of treat other people, and that being part of what the movie is trying to get across. So I'm curious how you think in general Mazursky really ties the humor of the film to the ethical and moral themes and moral concepts, and then also how you as authors approach the interplay of kind of comedy and these broader themes that you want to get across.
That's a great question. I mean, I think life is inherently funny, and people are inherently funny. And when you can portray them as they actually are, there's always comedy there. And I think it gets back to, I really think Mazursky is such a great humanist as a filmmaker. And there's always something unexpected in his characters that I feel like he sort of leans into these tropes, and then he like finds the flip of it, like the reality in that. And I think he does that very much. But I think the bumping up against expectations, and these characters that he creates is where the comedy really lies. Like it would be so easy to make Jerry kind of a one-note character, that he's just either totally sort of a con artist, or he's like a totally sort of good kind of like saint, and his whole purpose in this story is to just transform these people into better versions of themselves. And that's not how he functions in the story at all. He's complicated, and he's kind of both. He's like this very smart, wise person who also is kind of taking them for a ride. It's like but you don't like him less when you find out that he's sort of like lying to them. He's telling them what they want to hear. And some of it's true and some of it isn't. Like, I like that decision, that like, he obviously knows what he's doing. He does have like a certain amount of wisdom, but he really defies any ability to simplify him, either theirs, the characters in the movie, or the movies itself. And I feel similarly about Richard Dreyfuss and Bette Midler in the movie, that that on the one hand, yes, she's like this spoiled kind of jappy Beverly Hills housewife. On the other hand, she really is someone who is like deeply unhappy and truly on some sort of spiritual search, and is very self-aware and articulate about her self-awareness, and I like Richard Dreyfuss too. I mean, Richard Dreyfuss is such a weird actor. He's so intense in this movie, like just how crazy he is all the time about everything. Like he's got such a manic energy, and I think a lot of that is just him. But it lends this interesting kind of unrest to this character. Like, this is not someone that you feel like is really enjoying his life, even though he seems outwardly to have everything he's ever wanted. I mean, even like his sort of affair with Carmen the maid, like weirdly doesn't feel as exploitative as it could, because you have a sense that it's sort of mutual, and that it's all kind of sanctioned and condoned by his wife. And like, he just sort of, I don't know. It's interesting. It's like, you kind of get it. Like, and I think that it's finding those places where you get it, where people can do these things that like, I think we can be very simplistically condemnatory of. But that they all seem so justified and sort of like normal, and you don't hate anybody for anything they're doing. Like, to me, the subversion of that expectations is where a lot of the comedy in the movie lies, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, actually, this is both, this is also in response to a question that just popped up in the chat. I think it's both, which is, you know, in terms of dealing with social issues and the challenges of that. The question of guilt in this movie is really, really smart. And also the idea of fantasy as a response to one's own guilt. So like the savior, like to have a savior complex, right? And to sort of, especially I think now that well, I'll speak for, especially now that like there is so much armchair activism and so much, it's possible to live one's whole life now consuming the horrors and just like living a diet solely, you know, you can get it 24 hours a day if you want, you know, if that's your show, so to speak, if that's your like the story, you know, and but like what is that, you know, the question of what is kindness, what is action, are all forms of action like appropriate for all people, you know, what does it mean to rescue someone, how and what does that look like as a fantasy, which we see in the beginning of the movie, right, versus a reality, which we see towards the middle when Richard Dreyfuss is like, what have I done, you know. And I think too, like with Bette Midler, there's this fantasy of enlightenment, right? It's this enlightenment fantasy that like, I will get there, I will arrive. And I found it so interesting that in that moment, when the tension is leaving her body, she's like, I'm so afraid, you know, I'm so scared.
Tears.
Yeah. And it's like, you know, that surrender of control does not look like what the fantasy of the Enlightenment looks like. I think that's very much another way that it is a Jewish movie, you know, grappling with these questions of guilt and fear, and also even a savior complex. I mean, we look at, you know, Jesus was, you know, he was the Jew that went astray, and you know, but I think and the idea of tzedakah, right, and like to heal the world, and tikkun olam, and like I think the question of the fantasy of tikkun olam versus what does the reality look like, you know, is a Jewish question.
So one of the themes that the movie really seems to be doing, and Melissa, you cited this line earlier when they go to Venice, and he says it's like the 60s, is actually kind of making a referendum on the 60s in the 1980s, and what of these values have kind of still stayed. So all of this wellness, this enlightenment, you know, the daughter says, all these gurus, it's so 60s. And it's kind of like they've kept the like superstructure of enlightenment and like lost track, you know, of everything, you know, that was there. And I think that they really comes across in terms of this movie with the notion that Richard Dreyfuss's Dave Whiteman has, that, you know, the bum is the last person who is dropping out. And that this is the residue of the 60s is him electing, you know, not to do this. And it's very complicated because it seems to, you know, be treating homelessness as a kind of choice, that this is an act of dropping out rather than, you know, for any other the myriad reasons why people might become unhoused. And it's really of its time. It's kind of a Reaganite depiction of poverty as, you know, choosing not to work or electing not to work. And I'm wondering if you think the film is accepting this notion or it's criticizing it, and where the characters stand vis-a-vis, you know, that idea versus the viewer. And really doesn't matter for enjoying the film, you know, at all today, because we could always say this comes from the past.
Well, I think the film is kind of criticizing that. I also feel like that really only applies to Jerry. You know, like I feel like there's many other homeless characters in the movie that you don't necessarily feel that this is true of. You know, like I feel like the people on Venice Beach, you have a sense that they may not have all had the same experiences as Jerry, and we don't even know like what experiences of Jerry's are exactly real. You know, his friend that like comes to join them at the sushi restaurant, which is a hilarious scene, and doesn't want to eat anything, and then like he doesn't feel like that kind of a character. I mean, I feel like Jerry, like I feel like with creating Jerry the way that he did and having him played by Nick Nolte, I feel like Mazursky is certainly creating an unhoused character that is palatable to like an 80s audience, but he's also sort of satirizing that notion that they only really start to warm to him when he's like, oh, I had a Rolls Royce when I lived in London, and oh, I play the piano, and oh, I lived in an ashram in Oregon, and like they sort of have the sense like, oh, you're one of us, just some different things happened to you. And so I feel like it's sort of satirizing this notion a little bit of like, you know, that like they sort of start to see him more on their level as he sort of makes up these things, you know, this sort of past for himself that's relatable to them. And I feel like it's sort of, I feel like Mazursky is sort of saying in the movie, like they're able to like welcome him into their home and sort of see him as a human being because he can relate to them on this level. But what about all these people who can't, but they're still human beings, and I'm still showing them as human, you know? And that there's something, I think it's a little bit critiquing the notion that even though, you know, I feel like Jerry, I guess on some level is sort of a character of like the Reagan years, and that you have a feeling that like if he didn't want to be homeless, he could figure out some way to not be homeless, because he does basically, you know, he does figure out a way to not be homeless ultimately in the movie, which is to glom onto them. But I also feel like you don't get the sense that he's really asking anybody for anything, and you sort of, and it does sort of like criticize, I think, that kind of privileged point of view that needs to find these entry points into being able to like give these characters a full measure of humanity.
I mean, it's interesting that it's based on a French play, because there's definitely a very bohemian portrayal of, you know, of the homeless characters, and there's very little tragedy or sadness, at least in what I saw. I mean, to me, the saddest element was him waking up and you know, there was like some grime and him not being able to find his dog. But like, I mean, the homeless that we meet in Venice are very joyous,
very happy.
Yeah, very happy. You know, the man who gets invited to lunch he does a lot of laughing, you know, and we've got Jerry who seems to be choosing this path. So it's not, and yes, he does, you know, at the end, I think there's a moment where he says, well, like, you wouldn't have wanted to hear the real story, right? You wouldn't have wanted to hear how sad it was. But even the way that he became homeless, I mean, like we were talking about the 60s and this sort of bohemian, right? Like his story, whether it's true or not, was it started with the draft dodging and helping people, you know, forge or burn their draft cards, right? So there's like I definitely think there's like a nobility in it, and there's a bohemianness in it, and sort of almost his lifestyle, it's presented as a lifestyle, right? And like as something that he has chosen that maybe Bette Midler and I forget the characters' names, but that Bette Midler and Richard Dreyfuss have lost, right? Like there's something, you know, a spark. When Richard Dreyfuss says, I ate out of the trash last night and I loved it, you know, like that's what's missing, right?
Yeah. And that's such a specific, like, sort of boomer generational thing, I think, too, you know, that sense that like, well, we sold out, you know, we like stayed true to the ideals and
right, like that there's this dichotomy.
Yeah, I don't think we have that in the same way. So I feel like there's this sort of, I mean, generationally, like I feel like those of us that are like were children when this movie was made, like small children, were raised with like a totally different ethos and kind of like, you know, I don't think there's a sense that like people who are unhoused are somehow like purer ideologically or something than like we had the guts to be. Or that feels very sort of its time to me. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So Shayna popped on to open it up for audience Q&A. And we also want to give Paloma time to ask 1 or 2 questions, but hopefully we can go if you have time for another 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, I actually want to bounce off right what Rachel was just saying about this fantasy about poverty, because I was thinking of these other TV shows mostly, like The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, the OC. Neither of those are Beverly Hills, but still they're close enough. And even 90210, where there's a little there's the poor character who kind of infiltrates and mixes things up. And so my question is about how we can think of Will Smith's character and the guy from the OC, I can't remember what his name is. They come in and they sort of disrupt the lives of these wealthy people, and they do it in basically with their sexuality, right? They're disruptive sexually. That's part of the threat that they bring. And on 90210, if you remember the character Andrea, right? She's the poor character, and she's also the Jewish character. But she's not portrayed as sexy. She does not make a kind of sexual disruption, at least in the high school years. So I guess my question for you, maybe Melissa, if you want to start, is why is there this fantasy that poverty is sexy when in reality it is the opposite of sex for us? And does that fantasy of poverty have to be not Jewish in order to be sexy?
I might not watch enough TV to answer this question. I will say, remember Emily Valentine, though. Let's not forget Emily Valentine from Beverly Hills 90210. Yeah. Never forget. So, okay. So I think that, how can I address this? I mean, these are amazing questions. I think that, well, I mean, if you think about like, the notion of poverty from like a spiritual or a religious perspective, right? There's the idea of purity. It's seen as actually like antithetical to sin, right? Like there's, there's a greater chance of what is it, like getting through the eye, a camel through the eye of a needle than, and that's the Christian mythology. And so from like a religious or spiritual perspective, there's, the idea of poverty as a form of purity, right? And also like renunciation, that it's a chosen thing, which one might say that, I think that it could be argued that Nick Nolte's character is seen as someone who has renounced the world, right? Like does take after like the desert fathers, right? Who like renounce the world and go off on their own. In terms of sexuality, I think that other is often sexy. There's also the idea of, other is often sexy because it's fantasy, right? Like the fantasy of poverty is not the experience of poverty, it's the fantasy. And Richard Dreyfuss's like rescue fantasy is not the, it doesn't end up being the reality. Well, it sort of does at the end actually, but it's a fantasy. So I also thought it was like interesting that Bette Midler doesn't, well, we don't, if she does fantasize about Nick Nolte prior to, their moments of consummation, like she's not aware of it herself, right? Like she doesn't know until in that moment. So it's actually, it's not really her it's somebody else's fantasy, right? Like it's whose fantasy is it? But in terms of the question of, does it have to be a non-Jewish character in order to be like the sexy outsider? I don't know. I think I'd have to watch more television and movies.
I think if it's the outsider, like in this movie where all the kind of other characters are Jewish, like the not Jewish character is the outsider. If it's a world where everybody is not Jewish, then the Jewish character is the outsider, right? So like I don't know. I will say that like, Andrea had her moments. Like she on Beverly Hills 90210, like things almost got really real between her and Brandon for a little while. And then she got pregnant in college and had the twins and then all of that happened, so I feel like she had her sexy moments. She did seem about 15 years older than the rest of them, which I think was just a casting situation. I mean, I feel like the fantasy of poverty, it's renunciation, as Melissa says, but I think it's also this fantasy of simplicity, and it's sort of a lot of that in this movie too, that, oh, life would be so much simpler if I didn't have all this stuff, if I didn't have my hanger business to run, if I could just go live at the beach. And I think part of why it feels sexy is because like that version of simplicity is very much mingled with youth, when everybody is very sexy. Like back when you were sort of young and free and didn't have responsibilities and didn't have children and didn't have a job and everything was possible and everything was open, that there's a sense of like freedom and opportunity that comes with that like early stage in life that is a lot of people's first and sometimes only experience of sort of poverty in that privileged sense. Obviously, I think real poverty, especially as you age into it, is horrible and not sexy at all. So I don't know, I think in this movie and in a lot of things, it's very much that sort of fantasy of being like the starving artist, which is definitely a sexy trope.
So since Melissa brought this up, what do you think about, the end and that kind of final little shift, that's happening in all of the relations between the characters and the relations to wealth and each other? And one of the things that we've seen in this movie is there's been a kind of like transformation in the nuclear family of, within this household. And that it hits its realization at this like final moment when they're all smiling at each other.
I mean, I think it's probably weird to be in love with someone that your mom also had sex with. I don't know how that plays out in the future for them.
Yeah, I don't know about the end. I think I'm kind of neutral about the end. Like I didn't not love. Again, I was just looking for Kerouac mostly. I was looking for like the Kerouac Matisse showdown. Who's going to be. I also, though, there was a moment where I was afraid that Matisse was going to leave. Before I knew that he was sort of perking up. Yeah, I think I was more invested in the dog narratives than some of the human narratives. But to be fair, like in addressing the point that was made earlier, that sometimes we care about dogs more than humans. I would say that like I think that I care about all dogs more than all humans, right? It's not like certain, or I get invested. Like it's not certain segments, right? It's I mean, I've got my friend right here. Yeah.
Well, because we're getting close to the end, I want to mention one thing that one of our attendees said, which is that when he first read the program announcement, he confused Down and Out with another Jewish Beverly Hills movie, The Slums of Beverly Hills from 1998, where the Jewish characters really are kind of down and out. And I think maybe next time we run a series like this, we could put those two movies next to each other and think about ideas about Jews in Beverly Hills and Jews and poverty. Which is something that we don't see a lot of, right? Yeah. The association of Jews and money is one that we've seen plenty. But I do want to actually, instead of having Paloma ask a question, I want to ask a question that somebody in the audience has asked, which is, what did you, as a young person who did not grow up in the 80s, how did you respond to this film? What did you guys think about it or talk about it? What felt foreign and what felt relevant?
Yeah, I mean, we really enjoyed it. And it was actually, I think it was more fun to watch this movie like with a group of people, I think. Because yeah, like Eitan was like asking me, like, I wonder how you guys are gonna do with like the 80s pacing, but it felt, I mean, I don't know, it felt fun. It didn't feel like an old movie. And yeah, and definitely we enjoyed all the parts with Matisse, the dog, and yeah, I don't know. It didn't feel like I was watching something like old. It just felt funny, and I love Bette Midler. I'm obsessed with her, so I'd watch anything she's in. Yeah.
So I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Melissa, for being here. Thank you for Paloma, and thank you, Paloma and Shayna, as always, for your participation. This has been a really great episode of people in their late 30s and early 40s talk about the 1980s. Hopefully we can have another episode one day down the line. This is our last event of the quarter for this particular film series, but please, watch out for announcements of next quarter's programs.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.